Hello and welcome to the VO2 Lounge. This is episode 56 on how fit can you get on Zone 2 alone. Zone 2 is somewhat of a cult following, I would say. Pre-2020, people were all about that high intensity interval training or HIIT training on their assault bikes, on their watt bikes and all sorts of other things. Now they're all about Zone 2. Whether that's from the Human Lab, a tier drive, longevity crowd in general, or the Iñigo San Millán followers, I'm not exactly sure. But in this episode, I'm going through a couple of GCN videos again, which follow Manon, one of the presenters, through a training block that only contains Zone 2. Something that can often get lost in these videos like this is the fact that Zone 2 isn't actually something you perform on its own in complete isolation, and people can come away from these videos thinking exactly that. In this episode, there is a lot of jargon like lactate threshold, VO2 max, lactate turn point, LT1, LT2, so I'll do my best to explain each as they come up individually. The GCN episodes I refer to in this episode are how fit can you get if you only trained in Zone 2, and how fit did I get doing Zone 2. With some additional content coming from the High North Performance blog post titled Zone 2 Training and Lactate, dissecting Iñigo San Millán's advice. With all that said, let's get into this episode. One thing I will start by saying is that this is sort of, in my opinion, a classic GCN of present day video where the script writing leads you to think it's going to be miss the mark a lot. Especially on this episode where they're talking about Zone 2. Then they get to a point where they introduce the expert witness or coach or whoever it is, and the video becomes really worthwhile. But there's usually 5 minutes or so of just waffle and nonsense in some instances that maybe it does captivate people. I don't know. But for me at least, I often led there in that instance to be like, this really... why am I watching this? So if it was me to rewatch it, I'd skip to about 5 minutes 30 where they have the interview with the coach at that point and really highlights the points that we're going to go over, such as don't only do Zone 2 and what the benefits are, but what the shortcomings are, and in a way that isn't like, because Zone 2 has shortcomings doesn't mean you don't do it. It means you do it in like collaboration with other zones. But let's just start with what Zone 2 actually does to the body and a little note on lactate to start. So I promise this episode will get easier to follow as we go along, but we're just going to start with what lactate is because I think it plays a particular role in understanding what the purpose is essentially of Zone 2 work and what one of the adaptations that is coming from Zone 2 is, which is heavily related to lactate production, lactate recycling, so on and so forth. Now, when carbohydrates are broken down to produce energy, they first undergo a process called glycolysis, which converting glucose into pyruvate in the cytoplasm of the cells. Now, this process yields 2 molecules of pyruvate per glucose molecule, along with a net gain of 2 ATP molecules and 2 NADH molecules. Now, ATP, of course, the energy that you're using is just people refer to it as the energy currency or the fuel of the cell, and is what is causing these contractions to occur. So you're getting glucose and you're using it to and eventually create ATP. Now, depending on the oxygen availability, pyruvate follows different pathways. In aerobic conditions, it's converted into acetyl-CoA to enter the citric acid cycle and produce ATP, NADH, and FADH. While in an anaerobic condition, it's reduced to lactate, regenerating NADH plus to allow for glycolysis to continue producing ATP. Now, something that is also worth noting is that this, like lactate, is essentially always going to be present and be produced essentially, and the difference between mere mortals and couch potatoes and then the elites and so on is part of it is what is going on here, the rate of reuptake of this lactate produced in the muscle and how much is actually ending up in the bloodstream. We'll go on to that. But lactate once was considered a waste product and is what, for example, myself going through school at the ages of 15 and 16, studying some kind of physical education, whatever the title of it is, essentially some kind of minor sports science form of education, you learn that lactate or lactic acid, for example, is this waste product that causes your legs to hurt and is the limiter to performance. Is now recognized as a crucial energy source and a metabolic intermediary, essentially. It can be transported from muscle cells into the bloodstream and used by other tissues, such as the heart and the liver, where it can be converted back into pyruvate and utilized in the citric acid cycle again. Now, additionally, the Cori cycle in the liver converts lactate back into glucose, which can then be used by the muscles for energy, and then which obviously highlights lactate's role in facilitating energy production and the metabolic flexibility, which is where I think it's obviously so popular in the human lab peer-to-peer drive sphere, because this metabolic flexibility is a key marker of metabolic health, which is a key marker in reducing, for example, all-cause mortality and improving your overall longevity in both health and lifespan formats, which is why I think it's got this big uptake, and it's easier, in quotations, than like high-intensity work. So that's where I think it's, grown legs and ran off. Other metabolites produced alongside lactate during intense exercise obviously contribute to muscular fatigue. This is where this whole lactic acid thing essentially came from, which is the hydrogen ions released during pyruvate to lactate conversion can lower muscle pH. Lower in my head always we'll just get lowers muscle pH, causing acidosis and impairing muscle function. Accumulation of, because obviously, this is what I was going to say, is that lowering, because obviously 1 being very acidic, 7 being that neutral zone. So a lowering would be closer to acidic than alkaline. Now, accumulation of inorganic phosphates and ADP also interfere with muscle contraction and ATP production. Now, obviously, despite lactate's beneficial roles, elevated blood lactate levels are used as markers of metabolic stress and fatigue, which indicate a reliance on anaerobic metabolism and onset of decreased performance during high-intensity exercise. So that's lactate really in a condensed format to understand what's going on in the body, and then it's almost the anchor as to what we're referencing back and why, as we'll go through this, for example, results of just doing zone 2 without other zones, like for example, like a threshold workout, result in lackluster returns in the long term. So with that out of the way, let's move on to sort of defining zone 2, and a good source really for looking at it is, again, sort of scouring all the different bits of content, GCN and others, featuring Iñigo San Millán, who looks at zone 2 based on bioenergetics. And for the most part, really, zone 2 is this kind of endurance zone, but on a much more broader, convoluted way. Let's go through how he, for example, defines it. Now, focusing on energy systems engaged at different intensities is what I do. So he uses a 6 to 7 zone model and identifies zone 2 as the intensity that most effectively stimulates mitochondrial function, fat oxidation, and lactate clearance, primarily recruiting slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers, which are highly adapted for aerobic training and efficient in energy production through fat oxidation. Now, obviously, the reality is with humans and that there's going to be type 1 and type 2 recruitment here, really. And especially if you're becoming very aerobically developed, you're becoming more and more of an endurance athlete, you will essentially improve how well your type 2 fibers are performing essentially a type 1 role. So, but that's essentially what's going on. Now, in zone 2, both fat and carbohydrates are used for energy, but fat oxidation rates are near maximal, a characteristic sometimes referred to as fat max. This distinguishes zone 2 from zone 1 and 3, which also utilize fat and carbohydrates, but do not maximize fat oxidation to the same extent. At the higher end of zone 2, there's a significant increase in glucose metabolism, which this leads to higher blood lactate levels due to the breakdown of carbohydrates. As you know, pyruvate is a precursor, and as a result, lactate becomes produced. This increased lactate production is a key indicator of the shift in energy utilization in the top end of zone 2 intensity, really. Now, the midpoint of zone 2, where fat max is achieved, in theory, represents the optimal fat oxidation. But the precise identification isn't particularly crucial, as rates remain similar slightly above and below this point. Now, San Millán himself suggests zone 1 has a lower fat oxidation and muscle fiber recruitment than zone 2. Now, typically 40 to 60 watts below the top of zone 2. Where without lab equipment or like a lactate meter, defining zone 2 can be challenging from this perspective. So practical methods like using fixed percentage of FTP are often exploited. Max heart rate as well can be used, or very commonly referred to is the torque test, which is often recommended by coaches and the likes. The torque test, which also is endorsed by San Millán himself, gauges zone 2 intensity by the level of conversational ease. Now, distinguishing it from the easier zone 1 and the harder zone 3. Now, you essentially, it's just this point where you're obviously able to have a conversation. You're not struggling to talk, but it is definitely labored. There are gaps where you have to breathe and so on. If the conversation is as fluid as the one I'm having now, that is when you go, okay, I'm in zone 1. Whereas if it becomes a point where it is very spotty, then you're probably in zone 3 or higher. And that kind of helps to allow for the natural ebbs and flows of the human body and fatigue levels and so on and so forth, to allow for this easier identification of zone 2. Now, there are technologies now like real-time ventilation rate monitors offer like personalized adaptive training zone, and there's all these other kind of methods that measure heart rate in varying ways and can identify zone 2. But for the most part, you can just go off feel and go off this torque test and so on, and you're probably going to be okay. I appreciate at this point I have referenced the GCN videos that I said I was going to reference very little, but that's mainly because what I said at the beginning of the lead in to the point at which they start talking about the coach and the point at which on the second video they show the results is a bit wishy-washy for the most part. I do wonder whether with their return to being private, well, I say they are privately owned, but they becoming independent again, whether that changes things at all, I don't know. But I think really I thought it was important before we go look. The second video of the how fit I got from zone 2 alone is it is essentially a study. It was a 6-week period, with an individual of one, like number of participants, but I do think it is actually a great example of the best scenario for someone to get far fitter from an injection of zone 2, because the presenter's gone from basically no exercise or moderately low to now a structured by the fact that they're riding frequently and predominantly zone 2, but still shows where your gaps in your fitness essentially will emerge. But we will get to that, and I think just going through these pointers I've already referenced, like lactate and defining zone 2 and so on and so forth, in a semi-elaborate-ish way, is worth it to then get to the bit where we can kind of dissect the end results. Now, what are the key benefits of zone 2? Well, San Millán lists 3 key benefits of zone 2 training: improving your capacity to oxidize fats, meaning you can burn more grams of fat per minute and your fat max occurs at a higher wattage. And obviously that's very beneficial for endurance, because if you can output more power while still remaining primarily fueled by fat, then you've got a much greater capacity or greater time to exhaustion, because you are just simply using a fuel that is far more plentiful on your body. It also improves mitochondrial function, improves lactate transport between muscle fibers. They're the key benefits. Now, it's worth noting, though, that zone 2 riding is not the only intensity domain that helps build fat oxidation capacity, and is possibly not even the best intensity for achieving it, for example. The study from Ronistat Research Group, I'm probably butchering the surname, but is responsible for the popular 30-15 microburst intervals. They show some early indications that adding blocks of short 30-second periods to an endurance ride might enhance the stimulus for improved fat oxidation. Now, there are other bits of research. It's more just to highlight that it's not clear cut, and there are unfortunately no silver bullets in this, other than doing more volume is probably going to be better for you, but you still need to have a reasonable distribution of intensity and low intensity. Now, the suggestion that zone 2 optimally develops mitochondrial function and lactate transport is also debatable from other sources. People seem to have different opinions. There are people who believe that there are other complementary ways to develop these abilities, and probably need a combination of different intensities to develop these abilities optimally, in much the same way that building VO2 max needs different intensities in order to train different contributors to VO2 max. And to be honest, maybe I interpret it differently, but when I find that little extract there, essentially, it comes from predominantly like just a coaching platform, and I believed it until I really sat down and listened to a full discussion with Iñigo San Millán in it, is that he's not necessarily saying that you're only doing zone 2. There is a separate discussion where he's with Sai from GCN, and he suggests, yes, zone 2, of course, this incredibly important training zone, but there's also zone 4-esque, like threshold, makes up a large amount of, for example, Pogacar's training, because these are the 2 important bits. Obviously, other zones are important, but these are 2 very important zones for creating a elite cyclist. So when all this is taken, it's not that zone 2 only contributes to this, but it's that obviously it has a very strong contribution to the development of this mitochondrial function and so on and so forth. Now, there's other research by the David Bishop group who suggest that low intensity riding helps greatly with developing the number and or size of mitochondria in the muscle. High intensity riding is needed in order to improve the functioning of these mitochondria, by stimulating enzymes that play a role in aerobic metabolism. Now, this is really useful. I thought that's a very useful extract because it highlights the fact that essentially one function is building the roads, the actual like motorway, to deliver people to their destination, and the other is essentially the traffic management or teaching people how to drive or so on and so forth. It's one of them is actually building the infrastructure, and then one of them is utilizing the infrastructure to its maximal capacity. You can't, if you just do high intensity, then yes, you'll improve the function of the mitochondria, but you still need more of them and more efficient ones to increase your overall output. Now, before getting back to talking about the GCN episodes, just a quick additional note on defining zone 2, and that's to talk about Iñigo's model of training, how it appears, and that is the fact of training at the top end of zone 2, and he said in various videos about rather than a 5-hour ride, for example, a 6, you do a 4 or a 3, for example, at this higher level of zone 2 and get the same, if not a better response. I think it probably fits not that many people, and amateurs really. It's probably going to lead to burnout because of our lack of ability to really, one, recover from such taxing sessions, and also the fact that the level of control and being very diligent about remaining in that zone and not coming out of it, probably not as well managed by amateurs. And the reality is, training in a lower part of the zone 2 at least means that when the amateur surges a little bit, they're only surging to still within zone 2 or a little bit out of it. Well, when they're already riding at that high percentage, yeah, I think it has room to result in overtraining in amateurs in particular. There is a good idea of efficiency around it. If you're someone who doesn't like really doing 3-hour rides or 4 or 5-hour rides, can't do them because of time or doesn't want to do them, then yes, you could increase the kilojoule expenditure by sort of very carefully bumping up on the top end of this zone 2 zone to get the kilojoules up, get the adaptions up, whilst still retaining this. But it could also be that you've got 1 or 2 long rides on the weekend, then you've got 2 intensity rides in the week, and then maybe 1 or 2 just sort of hour and a half zone 2, just endurance rides, and possibly to help with recovery, those 1 or 2 rides that are like an hour and a half, you use them at zone 2, but just really at an endurance zone, like low end zone 2. They're just keeping things ticking over and keeping a bit of stimulus in the system for then the key sessions, which can be your 1 or 2 long rides and your 2 interval rides, essentially. Which is, I think, the best way to go about it if you want to experiment with such high levels of intensity of zone 2, like right at the end of the 75% of FTP, for example. So as I mentioned previously, let's get back to the GCN videos. Now, for me, the main takeaway from the first episode in the 2-part series is that zone 2 is not something to be prescribed on its own. And it's not, there's really very few circumstances in which you would prescribe it on its own for an extended block, unless you're just trying to build consistency and volume in an individual. Yes, there are examples like if you go on a cycling holiday or a holiday that's a training camp. The likelihood is that the stimulus there, if you're going from 10 hours a week to 20 hours a week, then that is enough stimulus in itself in that week. And also, to be honest, you're probably going to get some intensity, whether that's at threshold or whether that's at sweet spot or so on and so forth, just from going up climbs, for example. If you go to somewhere with long climbs, I know that's been the case in me in the past. I've tried to prioritize one long climb, maybe it's 40 minutes plus, where I do essentially one sweet spot block there, and that is essentially my devoted intensity for the rest of the time away, and the others are more kind of upper zone 2 sort of tempo-y kind of efforts up these climbs, but they are in some cases avoided. But essentially, zone 2 not on its own. Now, why am I even? I think I mentioned this already, but I think this series provides a good example of what the benefits are of zone 2, but why it's not to be done on zone. Now, in the first step test with lactate measurements, things were a bit of a mess, really. Now, if you haven't seen this video, essentially it was a bit like a ramp test, where the presenter is sat on a stationary bike. The intensity, say to begin with, is 60 watts, and then say 20 watts is added every minute, for example. And through that process, blood lactate is measured through like a pinprick of the ear. For example, most people listen to this know about lactate measurements, but the results were a complete, they were all over the place. Not because they were done poorly, but because just imagine the sort of quintessential LT1, LT2 graph. So those two inflection points where lactate begins, LT1 being the first point it begins to rise, and then LT2 being that second kind of inflection point where obviously it's rising, but now the rate of change is shifted again further by a notable amount. Now on this graph, there is no inflection point. It's essentially lactate is rising from the start, which arguably I don't know if they underestimated or / overestimated, should I say, her capabilities, and so only came to the point of measuring blood lactate at too high a wattage, essentially. Because in theory there should still be a point where blood lactate is steady. Maybe it was extremely low, but the argument here is it was just basically a ever increasing line from the get-go. I mean, imagine when you first start riding, or if you're someone who like rode to school or something, and it's just like no matter the intensity, it seems to be that your legs just burn at some point. Just it feels difficult, and that really can be somewhat characterized by this fact of that essentially lactate is being produced, not being used, and it's happening at this low intensity and runs away extremely quickly, and that fatigue builds essentially. Now the second time around, blood lactate is far more stable and represents what a traditional graph you would see, and it's stable up until about 160 watts, which you could argue is 40 watts approximately higher, and resembles, as I said, a more textbook LT1, LT2 inflection point kind of graph where the power is increasing along the bottom of the graph, and on the y-axis you've got the lactate measurements, and essentially that y-axis measurement is not increasing while the x is increasing, and then at a certain point the x-axis or power reaches an inflection point where lactate begins to move away from that steady state, that initial steady state point. Now, in these results, what they characterize is the bias towards poorly trained or untrained individuals, where doing anything is going to result in a change. But at the same time, the fact that obviously VO2 max, we all see, and we'll get to that in a sec, does change. It's highlighting what clearly is being improved most, and that's obviously was Iñigo San Millán has mentioned in many of different locations, is the fact that mitochondrial efficiency and mitochondrial density is increasing, and therefore allowing for this efficient use and reuse of lactate, and resulting in it reduced signs of it in the blood. Now, a little gem I'd point out. Now, I don't know, those who've seen the video, when the coach is referring to the 7% increase that is seen in the VO2 peak, the person editing for some reason highlights the LT1 as a percentage of VO2 max, which makes the jump look far more dramatic and impressive, as it looks like she went from 61 to 74%, 61 to 74, which I was scratching my head because I was like, that's not 7%, and then realized that it is in fact gone from 44 to 47 mil per kg per min. And so obviously VO2 max has been impacted here because many different factors feed into VO2 max. But as he goes on to say, is the next step here is high intensity work, which would now push this VO2 even further, and in general the 4 to 10 minute power would have increased. And this is where, if you're using someone who's poorly trained or untrained, the fact that they're exercising means their time to exhaustion in a 4-minute and 10-minute effort is going to improve, just because their ability to ride for 10 minutes has improved. But it really, there is the gem, is the little piece of information of, yes, affects VO2 max, but over this 6-week period, you can see, what would be good, to be fair, is if now this would highlight it the most, is the fact that, look, you've seen X increase in 4 and 10 minute power by doing zone 2, and then you're now semi-trained, and then you do another 6 weeks and see how it affects 4 and 10 minute power when you're actually doing threshold work. That's where you'd get the even bigger sort of insight into the fact that clearly it's not, you can't do zone 2 on its own. Now, when they end the episode with zone 2 does actually work, it's like you were kind of expecting nothing to happen. And that relates back to the script writing, where I just think it's like, come on. There's probably other things you can say, like, yeah, I don't know. But it always just gets me. I don't know. Now, this brings us to the end of the episode. So how fit can you get on just zone 2? Well, averagely so. Just get your intervals in as well. There's no silver bullet to training, is what you can clearly see here, is that even in an untrained state, you're still ending up with a not particularly balanced profile as an athlete, specifically in cycling. So what would your takeaways be from this episode? Feel free to reach out at the vo2lounge@gmail.com to let me know what you think. But also, if you are now left thinking, I want to know how to structure my training, or I've already got training and I'd like some insight into what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong, how I can differ things, then again, get in contact with the vo2lounge@gmail.com, where I can provide coaching consultation sessions at a reasonable fee, where we'll go through your data, we can go through races, we can go through whatever suits you, and we can highlight areas of potential improvement in your training and areas where you clearly have got things spot on. So for more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or in the VO2 Lounge Discord server, which is linked down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.